Okay. Now, I won't use the word der Führer in this company, but Drexel Sprecher is without doubt our leader. In these three reunions of Nurembergers, which he and his lovely wife Virginia, and I won't leave her out, believe me, have arranged for our pleasure here in Washington. Now, Drax was not a naval officer at Nuremberg. It's too bad, but Bill and I forgive you that, Drax. I know you can't all be in the Navy, but anyway, he was a distinguished Army officer, and he did represent his branch of the service with great distinction. There's no doubt about that. Drax served throughout the major trial, and he was the only member of our staff, by the way, to present the case against 2 defendants. Now, that was really an achievement. His first, Von Rosenstiel, was a lost cause, however, and Colonel Story, who was Jackson's first executive trial counsel, took pity on him and gave him a good defendant. Well, that was Cy Sinquart, wasn't it, right?
No, Von Schirach.
Oh, Von Schirach, yeah, Von Schirach, that's right. And he and Drex did a tremendous job in handling both of those cases. Now, after the major trial, Drex stayed on as the right hand of Telford Taylor, as you all know, in the subsequent trials. And he was responsible for the preparation of the record of those great 12 great proceedings. And that was a further contribution of Drex to the achievement at Nuremberg. So, Chief, it's yours.
Two score and 10 years ago, quote, paraphrase Lincoln, a number of you here helped bring forth what we've been hearing about.
Turn it. Turn the mic. Turn it.
Thank you.
You'll have to lean over a little bit.
What?
You have to lean over a little bit.
What I'd like to do is something a little different in terms of emphasis, but certainly not different in terms of being outside the scope of what we've already been hearing. I'd like to talk a little bit, and Bill has asked me, Whitney Harris has asked me to follow Bill in talking about some of the preparations for the trial in terms of some of the very specific things that happened. How many of you here worked for OSS before the trial began in Washington? There's a half a dozen or so. Well, I had worked for OSS in North Africa, training who? Germans, anti-Nazi Germans, to jump into Germany ahead of our troops. And so I was much impressed by the fact that an awful lot of Germans, represented by these 18 men, 17 of whom did jump into Germany ahead of our troops. There's no such thing as collective guilt as far as the Germans are concerned. It's a matter of being selective. So here I am in OSS, and I decided that I would try to develop a case with respect to the destruction of the trade unions and the building of the German labor front. And you saw on the pictures that were shown today, the defendant Lai, who was the head of the German labor front, after they had destroyed the free trade unions of Germany. And as I was in OSS, I went through all these tremendous documents that OSS had collected and all the reports they made. And I got a lot of material. I went to see the head of research and analysis, Franz Neumann, who wrote the book Behemoth, and I told him I was developing kind of a preliminary brief on the destruction of the trade unions. He says, well, I have something for you. And he reached behind him and he pulled out a book. And there, in an appendix to a German book which we got through Switzerland, OSS got through Switzerland, was a book in which this German author bragged about how he had been assisted lie in grabbing hold of the trade unions by seizing the headquarters, seizing their assets, throwing the trade union leaders into jail. And here was this order in the back of the book in which he bragged about this. That was the first original document that I found through OSS. Colonel Story passed through OSS and through Washington on the way to Paris, where Justice Jackson had chosen him to be the head of the documentation division. And after a month of studying around Washington, I flew to London and then into Paris. And Colonel Story said to me, look what we found, and there were the Rosenberg documents. Here in two fairly large rooms at 7 Rue Presbourg, which was the OSS headquarters formerly in Paris, there were documents in notebooks, Lights Ordiners. And Colonel Story showed me these and said, I'm getting all kinds of evidence about atrocities committed by the Nazis, but I haven't gotten very much yet about aggressive war. And could you find me something in these documents? Because I know Justice Jackson sees aggressive war as the encompassing thing of all the war crimes and crimes against humanity. We must find more documents on that. So he says, see what you can do. Well, my German, although I'd had 3.5 years in college and I'd traveled a little in Germany, my German was not that good, really, but Story assumed it I must have some knowledge of the language, what with my name and all. So he turned me loose that night. And as I looked at these Lights Ordiners, I noticed there was one that was thin, about half the size of the others, and it had on it APA Norwegen, APA Norway, Foreign Political Office of the Nazi Party, Norway. So I pulled this document down, and I started to look just before the invasion of Norway, and here was correspondence that Rosenberg had with Quisling, who later became the dictator in Norway, and they talked about the imminent invasion of Norway and its possibilities. Well, here was something on aggressive war. And so I took these documents in the next morning to Colonel Story, and he was very delighted, and I tried to make a rough translation. It was so horrible that later it was criticized greatly by another gentleman in London. But anyway, he took that and showed it to Justice Jackson, and Justice Jackson was highly impressed, and when I flew back to London, he called me in and congratulated me for having found this document in this little notebook. And so I was very happy to have gotten this form of introduction to Jackson. I had not met him before that very moment. Now, I know each of you that were our Nurembergers had some experience in helping move this documentary case along and in translating some documents and in making research of these SEAs, staff evidence analysis, which were mentioned here a little while ago, that Justice Jackson used in order to find out which documents were important enough to be pushed for translation and so on. Those staff evidence analyses were the thing that helped most of the lawyers at Nuremberg get enough knowledge and acquaintance with what the whole thing was really about, as shown by the documents. And those of you who are research analysts, to you we owe a great deal of thanks for having given enough of the interpretation of these German documents so that the lawyers who mostly spoke English could understand what they were about. wanted to talk about my first task in Nuremberg because I thought I'd be immediately put into following up and interrogating some witnesses whose names I had, anti-German Nazis who had survived, almost all of whom had been in Dachau for months or years, but who had finally gotten out, had survived. But instead of being able to do that immediately, Bill Baldwin, Colonel Baldwin, called me in and said, look at this building. The Palace of Justice where the trials were held, huge administrative building beside the courthouse. The windows had been blown in by bombs and by the shelling which was taking place at the time the Allies and the Americans moved into Nuremberg, and by the bombing which had taken place, even though it had only struck the building directly in one corner, one place. But the glass was all over the floor, and the books which had been stacked in shelves, many were on the floor, and the whole place was very dusty and so on. And Bill Baldwin says to me, I want you to take charge of getting this, clean this up. So here I am a lawyer, and he says, I've got some helpers for you. There's a bunch of SS men downstairs, which we're holding, and they are very anxious to stay out of the camp, and they'll help you do this. So literally, I became the boss of more than 20 SS men, and we went through the building and started to straighten it out and get the building in order. So you can see how lawyers are used in peculiar ways when they get involved with Justice Jackson and General Taylor later on and so on. There's a lot of things that one has to do and does that are quite different than if you were a lawyer here in this country trying a case. The work that I did in connection with the preparation of the two cases that Whitney mentioned could not have been done at all without the help of a number of research analysts in particular. And the support we got from all kinds of people who were there, brought over from the States, some brought from Great Britain, to help us put that trial on, was amazing. And I think all of us lawyers are particularly gratified to the bilingual or trilingual, in many cases, people, a number of whom are here, who helped prepare the trial in a specific way by making it possible for us to get the documents into shape so that either through translations or through the simultaneous translation system which has been mentioned, we could try the case. I wanted to say one thing about why I got to Nuremberg in the first place. I had these experiences during the war, and I'd been overseas for 2 years in North Africa and in England. And I got back, and I was used because I had been a trial lawyer with the labor board to try to settle some strikes at the end of the war and to get manpower into to a few key places. And all of a sudden, I saw in the newspaper Justice Jackson's first report to the president. Now, I'd like to quote just 3 sentences from that. There's other quotes from it here, because these struck me and I want to say why. Justice Jackson wrote, "The American case is being prepared on the assumption that an inescapable responsibility," we've heard a lot about responsibility here in connection with training teachers and younger people, but that an inescapable responsibility rests upon this country to conduct an inquiry, preferably in association with others, but alone if necessary, into the culpability of those whom there is probable cause to accuse of atrocities and other crimes. Then another excerpt, whom will we put to their defense? We will accuse a large number of individuals and officials who were in authority, not ordinary Germans, not people who've been subjected to propaganda for 12 years, but those who were in authority in the government, in the military establishment, including the general staff, and in the financial, industrial, and economic life of Germany, who by all civilized standards are provable to be common criminals. I was so impressed that we were going to hold an inquiry that I immediately got permission to fly from Chicago into Washington and got myself an interview with the General Counsel of OSS, Commander Jim Donovan. And within a half hour, I was recalled back to OSS from this special job I'd been on. And that is how I got to Nuremberg. It's been a great pleasure to work with Whitney Harris many times, and I just showed him this afternoon. He and I got together at Nuremberg and decided that the staff meetings that were being held in the documentation division and otherwise for the important research and analysts and for many of the younger attorneys in the documentation division and some from the interrogation division, that they needed to exchange more information. So in the months of September and October, before the trial began, we arranged for 20 seminars in the evening. And different people who had been in charge of different things, like Whitney on the Gestapo, and Nick Doman here, right there, he gave a talk on the concentration camps on which he had been working a good deal as a part of the interrogation division under Colonel Henry. And these informal meetings that we held in the evening, twice a week for a couple of months, did a great deal to integrate the staff and to make them know in more detail what everybody was doing in a way that you just couldn't do by the official announcements or by the bosses telling you. But we just interacted and had this experience, and it helped us prepare a good deal for the trial. I thought just telling you some of these very concrete things about what we did might be a little different than something that I could speak to you about, and I thank you very much.
On the afternoon of October 1, 1946, the International Military Tribunal convened in final session for the purpose of handing down convictions and sentences. Every chair in the courtroom was occupied, except the 21 chairs in the prisoner's dock. The defendants were to be brought into the courtroom, one at a time, to hear the sentences pronounced against them. At 10 minutes before 3, the panel door in the back of the prisoner's dock slid silently open. The defendant, Hermann Goering, stepped out of the elevator which had brought him from the ground floor and stood silently awaiting the words which were to decide his fate. The president of the tribunal spoke. Defendant Hermann Wilhelm Goering, on the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the International Military Tribunal sentences you to death by hanging. the number 2 Nazi turned on his heel and passed through the panel door, and there was a hum of whispered voices in the courtroom as those present awaited the arrival of the next defendant, Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Hess, who had flown his Messerschmitt to England in a futile effort to persuade the British to abandon the fight with Germany, was sentenced to imprisonment for life. The other defendants appeared in turn and received their sentences. 12, including Martin Bormann, who had been tried in absentia, and my defendant Ernst Koffenbrunner, received death sentences. 3, Hans Ritchie, Halmer Schacht, and Franz von Papen, were acquitted, and the remaining 7 received varying terms of imprisonment. After delivering the sentences, the tribunal adjourned sine die. Thus ended the trial of the major German war criminals before the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg at the end of World War II. On November 8, 1946, Mr. Francis Biddle, who had served as the United States member of the International Military Tribunal, recommended in a report to the President of the United States that the principles of the Charter should be reaffirmed by the United Nations. A few days later, the American delegation proposed a resolution to that effect, and on December 11, 1946, the General Assembly took note of the London Agreement of August 8, 1945, and the annexed Charter, and affirmed the principles of international law recognized by the Charter of the Nuremberg Tribunal and the judgment of the Tribunal. From that day forward, acts of aggression violated not only the common law of nations as declared by the Nuremberg Tribunal, but the written law of nations as enacted by the General Assembly of the United Nations. The precedent of Nuremberg is now indisputably the law of nations. 7 principles make up that precedent. The initiating and waging of aggressive war is a crime. Conspiracy to wage aggressive war is a crime. The violation of the laws or customs of war is a crime. Inhumane acts upon civilians in execution of or in connection with aggressive war constitute a crime. Individuals may be held accountable for crimes committed by them as heads of state. Individuals may be held accountable for crimes committed by them pursuant to superior orders. An individual, and this is the last, an individual charged with crime under international law is entitled to a fair trial. These 7 principles constitute the legal precedent of the trial of the major German war criminals before the International Military Tribunal. They were applied in other trials and proceedings following the end of World War II. The first was the Tokyo trial. An international military tribunal was established in the Far East under a proclamation of January 19, 1946 by General Douglas MacArthur as the Supreme Commander of the Allied powers in the Pacific. The tribunal of 11 members convened on April 29, 1946 to receive the indictment. The trial opened for the taking of evidence on June 4th, and the judgment was handed down during the period November 4, 11, 1948. The Charter of the Tokyo Tribunal incorporated the definitions of crime which had been set forth in the Charter of the Nuremberg Tribunal, and the specification of charges closely followed the Nuremberg indictment. The Chief of Counsel for the United States at the Tokyo trial, Joseph B. Keenan, wrote that the Tokyo case confirmed and reinforced the massive achievements of the Nuremberg Tribunal. 7 defendants received the death sentence, 16 were sentenced to confinement in prison for life, 1 for 20 years, and 1 for 7 years. The second, military commissions. The Nuremberg trial constituted a limited precedent for the trial of persons charged with the commission of conventional war crimes by occupying powers through their own military commissions. Special military tribunals were established at Dachau for this purpose by order of the United States Commander, European Theater. Of the 1,672 individuals brought to trial before these tribunals, 1,090 ultimately were sentenced, 426 receiving the death penalty. These trials, which were completed on December 30, 1947, were based upon acts which occurred during the course of the war and which fell within the definition of traditional war crimes. Third, denazification proceedings. On March 5, 1946, the three German Länder in the United States zone of occupation joined in the enactment and promulgation of the Law for Liberation from National Socialism and Militarism, more commonly known as the Denazification Law. The purpose of this law was not primarily to punish, but rather to remove from leadership Germans who had taken a leading role in the Nazi conspiracy. Accused persons were subject to classification as major offenders, lesser offenders, and followers. Major offenders were subject to permanent exclusion from public office, confiscation of property, and detention for as long as 10 years. The law called for the registration of over 13 million persons in the United States zone of occupation. Of these, approximately 3 million were found to be subject to classification under the law. Ultimately, about 545 tribunals, employing a personnel of 22,000, were engaged in the task of classifying offenders in the United States zone alone. In spite of amnesties granted by the military government, over 930,000 individuals were actually tried by these tribunals. Only 1,549 were classified as major offenders, but 21,000 were denominated as offenders, 104,000 as lesser offenders, and 475,000 as followers. Over 500,000 persons were fined, 122,000 suffered restrictions upon employment, 25,000 were subjected to property confiscation, 22,000 were declared ineligible to hold public office, 30,000 were required to perform special labor, and 9,000 were sentenced to confinement. The findings of the Nuremberg Tribunal were helpful in these proceedings, particularly with respect to membership in organizations declared criminal by the tribunal. And finally, subsequent proceedings. On December 20, 1946, the Control Council for Germany enacted Law Number 10 for the purpose of establishing a uniform legal basis in Germany for the prosecution of war criminals and other similar offenders other than those dealt with by the International Military Tribunal. Cognizable crimes included crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity as defined in the Charter of the International Military Tribunal, and in addition, membership in categories of criminal groups or organizations declared criminal by the International Military Tribunal. On October 18, 1946, United States Military Government Ordinance Number 7 took effect to provide for the establishment of military tribunals in the United States zone of occupation for the trial and punishment of persons charged with offenses recognized as crimes in Article 2 of Control Council Law Number 10. And on October 24, 1946, the Office of Chief of Counsel for War Crimes, which had been held by Justice Jackson, was transferred to the Office of Military Government for Germany, and General Telford Taylor was placed in charge of the prosecution of war criminals before United States military tribunals in the American zone. 12 trials, most of which involved several defendants, were completed in the subsequent proceedings conducted under the authority of Military Government Ordinance Number 7. After taking into consideration the commutation of sentences ordered by the High Commissioner for Germany on January 31, 1951, 13 defendants received the death sentence, 8 were imprisoned for life, 77 were sentenced to terms of imprisonment 33 were released on the basis of time already served, and one received a medical parole. These extensive judicial proceedings after the close of World War II followed the Nuremberg precedent. Thereafter, for nearly half a century, despite repeated acts of aggression and war crimes throughout the world, the Nuremberg precedent was not applied. Throughout the years of the Cold War, which did not end until the Berlin Wall came down on November 9, 1989, the world was apprehensive of the possibility of a third World War in this century between the Soviet Union and the United States and their respective allies. The wars in Korea and Vietnam, in which the United States was directly involved, were typical. In the international setting which then prevailed, there was no possibility of a judicial assessment of personal responsibility for acts of aggression for war crimes. With both the United States and the Soviet Union free to exercise veto power in the Security Council, no possibility existed for the establishment of a war crimes tribunal to determine fault and assess punishment in any conflict in which their interests were significantly involved. The first realistic opportunity for the United Nations to bring an aggressor under the rule of law was the attack by Iraq under Saddam Hussein upon Kuwait on August 2, 1990. In November of that year, the United Nations authorized enforcement action against Iraq. On January 17, 1991, Allied forces attacked Iraq. Kuwait was liberated the following February 27th, ending a 7-month occupation by Iraq, during which thousands of Kuwaitis had been killed, kidnapped, or taken hostage. During the last weeks of the occupation, men under the age of 40 were singled out for arrest and torture, and young women were raped by undisciplined soldiers. Before retreating to Baghdad, carrying truckloads of stolen booty with them, Iraqis had sabotaged 732 Kuwaiti oil wells, detonated power and desalination stations, and badly damaged Kuwait's 3 naval ports and the Kuwaiti International Airport. The Iraqi attack upon Kuwait by the tyrant Saddam Hussein cried out for retribution. Yet the coalition, so successful in the military operation Desert Storm, proved incapable of punishing the perpetrators of these massive war crimes committed by the leaders of Iraq under Saddam Hussein. In March of 1991, the second Nuremberg reunion was held here in Washington. I was asked by Drex to chair the Committee on Resolutions. We proposed a resolution drafted principally by our Nuremberg comrade Walter E. Brudno, since deceased, proposing that the United Nations, the United States and its coalition partners, and all peace-loving nations take all appropriate action to investigate, indict, prosecute, and punish those Iraqi nationals who have planned and prosecuted an aggressive war against Kuwait or committed war crimes or crimes against humanity in the course of that war in violation of the Nuremberg principles. The participants in the reunion adopted the resolution. As chairman of the committee, I was able to have the resolution read into the congressional record by Senator Kit Bond of Missouri. Thereafter, several of us sought to obtain the prosecution of Saddam Hussein and his associates for the aggression and crimes which they had committed against Kuwait. The major stumbling block was that Saddam Hussein was safe in Baghdad, from which he could only be taken by force. We were advised that Great Britain would not agree to a trial in absentia, although no such concern had been expressed in the trial of Martin Bormann in absentia before the International Military Tribunal. The absence of a judicial forum competent to try Saddam Hussein and his collaborators was offered as an excuse for the failure of the United States and its allies to punish Iraqi crimes. 45 years after the Nuremberg judgment, there still was not in existence an international court of criminal justice which could indict such war criminals. The Security Council, which had so readily committed a massive military action against Iraq, was unwilling to establish even an ad hoc international military tribunal after the Nuremberg model, competent to indict and try Iraqi war criminals. Even if such a tribunal had been denied authority to try war criminals in absentia, it could have received evidence establishing the prima facie war guilt of Saddam Hussein and his collaborators. Over 5 years have passed, and the major war criminal since Adolf Hitler remains in power, not even under indictment for the massive war crimes he has committed, a blight upon the rule of law and the precedent of Nuremberg. This failure has been rectified in part by the establishment of ad hoc international criminal courts to deal with war criminals in the civil wars of the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. The disintegration of the former Yugoslavia and the incredible mass murders in the Rwandan conflict of 1994 stirred the Security Council into realization at last that armed conflict with its consequential war and humanitarian crimes must be dealt with on the legal plane if a law-abiding world is ever to be realized. These tribunals will receive evidence establishing prima facie cases against the defendants over whom it is unable to obtain jurisdiction. Individuals who appear before the court will be tried and, if convicted, confined in a special United Nations prison at The Hague. The jurisdiction of the Rwanda Tribunal is limited to the period of 1994. The jurisdiction of the Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia is, however, ongoing. 53 persons have been indicted thus far by the Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. 43 Bosnian Serbs, 7 Croats, and 3 members of the Serbian army. 2 of the indicted Serbs are in custody of the tribunal, and 1 Serb is in custody awaiting possible indictment. The first individual to be tried will be Dusan Tadic, a Bosnian Serb who was turned over to the tribunal by Germany, charged with raping, killing, and torturing Muslims in a concentration camp. His case is set for trial in May. The prosecution faces the difficulty of obtaining witnesses to support the charges, and Tadic is expected to move for dismissal on the ground that he is unable to obtain witnesses in his own defense. 2 Serb officers, General George Ducic and Colonel Alexa Kuzmanovic, who were jailed on suspicion of the commission of war crimes when they inadvertently entered Bosnian territory, were flown in an American NATO plane to the Netherlands on February 12 for investigation. One of them, General Ducic, has now been indicted for indiscriminately bombing citizens of Sarajevo. He will be the second person to be brought to trial. Radovan Karadzic, the Bosnian Serb political leader, and Ratko Mladic, commander of the Bosnian Serb army, both of whom are accused of genocide, have thus far avoided arrest. A few days ago, Mladic, maybe you noticed this, joined Bosnia's Serb National Guard cadets skiing on Mount Jaharina near Sarajevo. He has threatened that NATO-led military forces will pay heavily if they try to arrest him. His bravado, however, may not succeed in avoiding arrest. Secretary of State Christopher left the March 18 meeting of Balkan leaders in Geneva with the expectation that both Karadzic and Mladic will be handed over to the tribunal in due time. Mr. Tuđman, the Croatian president, has agreed that Timur Vlasic, the indicted Bosnian Croat general, will submit himself to the tribunal by the end of this month. If this happens, Mr. Milosevic, who represented the Bosnian Serbs at the Geneva meeting, will be under heavy pressure to turn over Karadzic and Mladic to the tribunal. These commitments will be reviewed at tomorrow's meeting of foreign ministers in Moscow. The War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia faces difficulties which were not encountered by the International Military Tribunal. Germany had surrendered to the Allies unconditionally, and the prosecuting powers controlled both land and people. Once located, defendants and witnesses could readily be produced for prosecution or defense. In addition, enormous quantities of documents and data were available to both sides. The tribunal for the former Yugoslavia is severely handicapped by the difficulty of obtaining custody of defendants, witnesses, and physical evidence. Support for the tribunal is indicated by the recent agreement of President Slobodan Milosevic of Serbia to allow the tribunal to open an office in Belgrade and to surrender witnesses and possibly defendants to The Hague. The trials taking place in the Netherlands are in fundamental aspects distinguishable from the trial of the major German war criminals. The primary charge at Nuremberg was for initiating and waging aggressive war. Crimes against humanity were restricted to inhumane conduct, including genocide, committed in the course of aggressive war. War crimes were those generally recognized in international conventions. The current trials at The Hague are not based upon a charge of aggression, in the course of which traditional war crimes and humanitarian crimes took place, but rather upon humanitarian crimes committed in a racial war setting. Thus, the accused are called upon to answer for ethnic cleansing or genocide, for mass rapes, for torture and killings in concentration camps, for mass murders, and for offenses against United Nations peacekeeping forces. These trials are certain to advance the international law of crime beyond the precedent of Nuremberg. Last September, I participated in a conference on the Nuremberg Trial and its significance today at Nuremberg, Germany. Among the participants was Judge Richard Goldstone, the chief prosecutor for the War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. In the course of his remarks, Judge Goldstone declared, "There are now laws of war which apply not only to international armed conflict, but also to internal armed conflict or civil wars. Why then, one must ask, do the horrors of war crimes continue to proliferate as they do? One of the reasons, in my opinion, is the absence of an effective enforcement mechanism. The best possible laws will have no effect in preventing or even curbing criminal conduct if there are no means of enforcing them. That is, apprehending, trying, and punishing persons who transgress those laws. Criminal conduct can be curbed not only by passing laws, but also by instilling at least a fear of apprehension and punishment. That is certainly true in respect of national states. In my opinion, it is no less true in respect of the international community." Judge Goldstone is to resign this fall as chief prosecutor of the War Crimes Tribunals for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. He will be succeeded by Judge Louise Arbour of the Ontario Court of Appeal. Judge Arbour supports the principle of individual responsibility. Crimes are committed by people, she has said. They are not committed by abstract entities like nationalities. But she believes that the primary responsibility for arresting individuals indicted by the Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia rests with the Balkan leaders who signed the Dayton Peace Agreement, not with the NATO-led peacekeeping forces. Balkan leaders will be reluctant to surrender their citizens for trial in The Hague. Thus, the tribunal will continue to face the difficulty of obtaining physical custody of persons indicted for humanitarian crimes. Thomas J. Dodd, succeeded Colonel Robert G. Story as the Executive Trial Counsel for Justice Jackson at Nuremberg. Last October, as we heard today, a center was dedicated in his name at the University of Connecticut. In opening the conference, President Clinton declared his support of the current war crimes tribunals. By successfully prosecuting war criminals in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, he said, we can send a strong signal to those who would use the cover of war to commit terrible atrocities, that they cannot escape the consequences of such actions. Of even greater significance, as Senator Dodd pointed out this morning, was the President's endorsement of the creation of a permanent international criminal court with jurisdiction under the Security Council over individuals who commit aggression and related war crimes and humanitarian crimes. A proposal to establish such permanent court to deal with future aggressors and war criminals is now pending before the General Assembly of the United Nations. This, it seems to me, the President said, would be the ultimate tribute to the people who did such important work at Nuremberg. Thank you. And now we're reduced to just two, but I think we've got outstanding people in the audience likewise who may be able to answer some of the questions or perhaps make comments. But Drex and I are certainly happy to take any questions or to receive any comments. There's my dear friend. Oh, come up here. This, I want you to know, I love this man. He helped me. I think he helped me more in my work in Nuremberg than anyone in the entire world. Walter, doggone it. Werner what do you got to say?
Well, thank you for giving me this gracious introduction, but I really did not want to talk about you. I wanted to talk about the one man who's gone, because I think he is really the man who has given what you might call class to Nuremberg, and that's Justice Jackson. And I only want to tell you a very brief story about Justice Jackson. And it took place, I think, on October 21st, 1945, which was a couple of days after the indictment had been served. And the indictment was served on the 22 people, and each one of the 22 people received a copy of the indictment in English and a German translation affixed to it. And to all the 22 indicted people, there was given a stack of documents about this high. But only one copy of each document, so they had to fight these 20 people to get access to the document. And so, by the 21st, which was about 4 days after the indictment, the defendants had gotten together and said, this is not proper. And they asked Dr. Diggs, one of their most persuasive defense counsel, to make a petition, and the petition was handed down to Justice Jackson's staff conference. And Justice Jackson had sitting next to him Colonel Story, and there were about 100 people in the audience. And Colonel Story said, Mr. Justice Jackson, we have here a strange petition. And he read, Justice Jackson said, well, read it. And so he read the petition, and Justice Jackson turned to Colonel Story and said, well, what do you propose to do? And Colonel Story thought for a moment and said, Mr. Justice Jackson, I think I would deny the petition, because we are going to hang most of them anyway. At that moment, I do not know what motivated me, but I raised my hand and I got up. And I said, Mr. Justice Jackson, I completely agree with Colonel Story that most of the defendants, or a good portion of them, will be hanged. But I do not believe that the defense counsel will be equally hanged, because the defense counsel are certainly those people who will make the determination of whether or not this was a fair trial. There was a moment of silence, and Justice Jackson turned to his right and said, Colonel Story, please call up General Clay and tell him to send up 2 topographic companies to Nuremberg at once to print the documents which the defendants must have. And there was silence in the whole room, and I believe that there was no greater moment in my life where I have seen justice and fairness demonstrated. And then there was a moment more silence, and suddenly Justice Jackson said, Lieutenant, you made such a valiant plea for the defendants. Will you please take control of the defendants for the next week until the documents come in, and see to it that they don't fight over the few documents that they have? And I sat down. I had my next assignment. Thank you very much.
What a wonderful human being this man is. More questions?
Well, Mayor, Zach.
Well, we'll have this lady here.
Mr. Harris, thank you very much for that. Pardon my croaking. Thank you for that marvelous exposition of the Nuremberg principles and your discussion of the necessity for the punishment of war criminals. My question is this, incidentally. I think that everybody who is at Nuremberg in this room would agree with you that we have to have justice with peace.
Oh, there's a microphone over there.
Could you give her the mic?
Okay, we have a microphone.
We're going to either have to use the mic or else someone repeat back into the microphone so everyone can hear.
Yes, well, I will repeat her question, which is.
I think that most of us, can you hear me now?
Yes, that's right.
Most of us would agree with you, those who were at Nuremberg, that that justice, that peace without justice is an empty thing. Justice being the punishment of war criminals. But I would like to ask you what you say to people, including some of the finest people of our generation, people like President Carter, people like General Schwarzkopf. What do you say to them when they say the important thing is to stop the killing? And if it is absolutely essential that we deal with the murderers, we must deal with them in the interest of peace.
Well, certainly we want to stop the killing, but does that mean that necessarily that justice cannot prevail? Do we have to deal with the traitor, with the top murderer? Do we have to give him freedom in order that others will be convicted or dealt with? I don't see any conflict in this at all. As far as the Kuwaiti War was concerned, we just stopped, that's all. And there was good reason for stopping. That was, of course, the agreement that we entered into with the other Allied powers, that all that they were commissioned to do was to free Kuwaiti from the Iraqi aggressors. There wasn't any prior agreement that we would go ahead and deal with Saddam Hussein afterward. But there was no deal made with Saddam Hussein to that effect. And Saddam Hussein right today, as far as I'm concerned, is a potential war criminal. I don't see any reason why Saddam Hussein couldn't be indicted right now if we had an international court available to deal with the case. I think the whole problem here is we haven't had the judicial instrumentality in place to deal with these people when they commit their crimes. And they don't understand at the outset that they're going to be prosecuted. Now, from now on, I believe, as a result of the action of the Security Council in establishing these ad hoc tribunals for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, aggressors around the world and humanitarian criminals must understand that the possibility very well exists that they may be brought to trial and answer for their crimes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, sir. Oh, Nick, come on up here, buddy.
Does this work?
Sure.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. There has been indeed very little following of the Nuremberg principles and the Charter. One reason is that very few of the national legislature chose to adopt the Charter and the Nuremberg principles as part of their domestic law. It's true that the United Nations on December 11, 1946, I believe, adopted the Charter. France adopted the Charter, and the Nuremberg principles are part of the French Civil Code, part of the domestic law of France. And they have been applied at the Barbie trial from 1987 to 89. And I think what should be done, and I don't know what this group could do, is to promote the adoption of the Nuremberg Charters in the municipal laws of the major jurisdictions. Until this is done, the Nuremberg principles will be regarded as an alien law, as a special law, as part of the United Nations, which is not part of our law that we respect. And it would be regarded as, by Corporal New or Pat Buchanan, as part of something else, as Corporal New did not swear allegiance to the United Nations, and he refused to wear the UN blue helmet. That's approximately how many Americans view the Nuremberg Charter.
Thank you for that, Nick. Do we have other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
How do you distinguish between a just and unjust?
Can you get the microphone, please, sir?
My question is, how do you distinguish between a just or an unjust war?
Want to answer that question? I give the easy ones to Drexel.
A war that is undertaken clearly in defense to an aggression is a just war, to take the simple case. Now, in the case of ethnic groups which are in collision over their notions of loyalty to a particular group or a particular nation, when you start to have conflicts between them, even within a nation, then you certainly have a question as to whether or not internationally you can declare that this is an unjust war. We know it is, of course, but whether you can distinguish and deal with that kind of a thing as readily as we'd like by tribunal is much more difficult. And I think that the recitation which Whitney Harris gave us concerning what has been done in Yugoslavia was quite an enlightening thing to me because of some of the detail. But if you'll notice, I don't believe any of the indictments have involved aggressive war. And so this is a point where, as Nick Doman has said, if the charter of the London Agreement, the charter of the Nuremberg, were incorporated in domestic laws, it would be another means of more people understanding the significance of dealing with conflicts that do involve large numbers of people. I'm not sure this is a good answer to you.
An excellent answer, and I appreciate it.
I have one other suggestion. If you want to read Grotius, Hugo Grotius, he can also tell you the difference between a just and unjust war. Anybody? Right here. There's a microphone over there, or you can come up here, or whatever you want.
I see this as a reunion of people who are proud of what they did, the most significant assignment they had in their lives. But I've heard two things here that prompt me to say, first of all, the stars are those who get up in the tribunal and who speak, the litigators, so to speak. And their names are in the record. But you'd be surprised, your names are in the records too, whatever you did. If you look at any SEA, these staff evidence analyses, the research analyst's name is on it. And we've got tons of them in the new National Archives building. The other thing is that the defense, once they protested, was taken well care of. So all you have to do is look at all the defense document books and see how they loaded they are with copies of the captured documents and even non-captured documents like Chester Nimitz's affidavit, which stated that we gave similar orders to submarines in the Pacific that Dönitz gave to his submarines, which meant that Dönitz had to be convicted for having succeeded Hitler as president, but not for illegal submarine warfare. So the records are there, and I think if you're still of a mind to go back and write your memoirs, you will find some help there in those records.
Thank you, Bob. Yes? Eddie?
I fully agree that Saddam Hussein should be brought before a court and tried. However, my question is, the United States has enacted a blockade by which it hopes to bring down Saddam Hussein. And what it's really doing, it is killing the people in Iraq. There's starvation, there is not enough medicine, and I'm wondering, is the United States guilty of crimes against humanity?
You see, that might not be the right way to bring down Saddam Hussein. Not being a politician, I don't know the answer to that. But if the Security Council established an ad hoc war crimes tribunal to deal with war crimes committed during the Iraqi-Kuwait war, then we would have a facility by which the guilt of the leaders could be measured, and perhaps in that way we could deal with this problem. Now, it's true that at this point there is no way that this tribunal would be able to obtain actual custody of Saddam Hussein. That's right, unless he would wander out of the country by mistake. but nevertheless, a prima facie case could be established, branding him as a war criminal and subjecting him to certain punishment if he ever did step out of his country. Perhaps that would be a better way than to discredit and bring down Saddam Hussein than to the type of treatment that is being given to Iraq, which is harmful to the people. I don't know about that. Well, what was it, Haiti? I thought that was it.
The question was whether the United States is guilty of crimes against humanity as a result of the blockade that we have put in place against Iraq, which is causing starvation, which is causing a tremendous shortage of medicine, and furthermore, citizens of the United States, myself included, are not allowed to ship any medicines or food to Iraq.
Well, I can't answer that. And from a legal standpoint, I think that it really is a political question. And I really don't know whether you can say that we are guilty of any such crime by blockading this rogue state. Margaret Thatcher just made a speech at Fulton, Missouri, a few days ago, commemorating Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain address at that locality, and she commented upon the problem that we are facing now in the world of rogue nations, which do not recognize the principles of law at all, and which if they are able to get totally destructive weapons, can constitute a real threat to the peace and security of the entire world. So if Iraq still remains a rogue nation, maybe this is a problem that we have to deal with on that basis. I think, though, that we're not dealing here with crimes as such. I think we really are dealing with political problems. You want to comment on that?
I've been told that we have to terminate because we're beyond our time, and because they have to set up the table for our dinner here, after which we will continue this evening. Just let me refer to the agenda. We're now going to have a social hour in the William Penn Room, which you will find not too far away from here. And there will be a bar there, so that you will be able to relax from this very serious discussion you've had. Now, one other thing, please do be back here so that we can have dinner at 6:15. Thank you. Sorry.
No. Ladies and gentlemen, if we could please...
We need to move on with the program, and even if you're still drinking your coffee, you can drink your coffee quietly. We'll be able to carry on and with our meeting. Our next speaker is Dr. Michael Berenbaum, who is a distinguished student of the Holocaust and of history in general. And Bern.
First of all, it's a privilege to be here and to be with you. And one of the reasons it's a privilege to be with you is more than almost anyone, I can appreciate not only your labors of 50 years ago, but the fruits of your labors as we see it in the contemporary world. I think what's most remarkable when we look back on the events that you lived through is the degree to which you were the first articulators of what had happened, the first to gather evidence, the first to document the crime, the first to give us a vision of precisely what had happened, and the first to bring together all of the material that subsequent generations, such as my own, have been able to work with over time. It's an extraordinary achievement, and none of what we have been able to accomplish in understanding the Holocaust would have been possible without what you did. And as one of the generation that has followed you in trying to articulate this event and to understand this event, the first feeling that I have this evening is one of immense gratitude. Let me also say something about the impact of what you have achieved, because I've faced it now on 2 occasions in recent months. You know, the tragedy of the world in which we live is that the Holocaust has, rather than decreasing in importance, increased in importance over recent years. Years ago, when we started thinking and dreaming of creating the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, we could have imagined that the museum would be built to an event of the past that would not have resonance for the future, that it would not be relevant for the future. And would that it were so. Would that one could have said that the events of 50 some odd years ago were so tragic, so terrible, that humanity had learned its lesson, heeded its call, and behaved differently. But virtually every month and every year, we hear more of the resonance of the Holocaust. 3 simple examples. We have in the museum a movie on the Nazi short film on the Nazi rise to power, which deals with the origins of fascism. Through my entire life, fascism was not an option. We had communism, socialism, a whole range of forms of totalitarianism, but fascism was not an option. And in recent years, with elections in Italy and in the former Soviet Union, all of a sudden fascism is an option. And some of the feelings that fringes in other countries touch on that political system. I had 2 occasions in recent months to appreciate anew the importance of your work. Last November, I was invited to Rwanda. And I was invited to Rwanda to advise the government of Rwanda, along with a small team of quotation marks experts, to advise the government of Rwanda on how to document what had happened there. And I had a sense that for me, a student of the Holocaust who was born after the Holocaust, and who came to study this event after the early articulations were done, I had the real sense that I was being thrust back into 1945 and 46, when all you had were fragments of information, were rumors, some eyewitness statements, and all sorts of results of devastation. And out of the fragments, out of the real fragments of the devastation, one had to create a gestalt of the whole, an understanding of the whole, and for me, in terms of a historical articulation of what had happened. You had one advantage, one disadvantage. The advantage you had in your work was that the Germans were meticulous. They kept enormously detailed records. And for a historian who has read many of these records, I know that you can drown in the detail. And in that sense, you could piece together only fragment of fragment from document after document. But in Rwanda, they didn't even have that. And yet, in Rwanda, the first model of what they wanted to do to begin the process of healing in their society was to bring the perpetrators to justice. Let me tell you something, they wanted to bring 52,000 people to trial. Now, as prosecutors, as people who've been around the prosecutorial team, I think we could only get a unanimous judgment that that is what, impossible, beyond the ken. And the interesting thing is they wanted to do it in 114 centers. The reason they wanted to do it in 114 centers is the bulk of their witnesses have never been anywhere that they had not walked to. I'm not talking about riding a bus, I'm not talking about riding a truck, I'm not talking about riding a car, a cab, or a train. I'm talking about not even riding in a horse and buggy in a wagon. They've never been anywhere that their feet had not taken them, and yet even there, they had heard of Nuremberg, they had esteemed Nuremberg, and they saw it as an essential part of their movement into the future. I sit on a small advisory team that's advising the United Nations and the courts that are involved in bringing to justice the perpetrators of mass murder in Bosnia. And for them too, the image of what they want to achieve is what was achieved. Perhaps, well, let's not even say what was achieved at Nuremberg, what was aspired to at Nuremberg, which is to take out of ashes of destruction and to rekindle a certain flame and a certain passion for justice. So anybody who stands before you humbled by what you have achieved, and understanding the importance of what you have achieved for generations, because the image is that in the aftermath of destruction, it is still possible to get a semblance, an articulation, a preliminary utterance of justice. And even if it's not proportionate, even if it's not equal, even if it's not approximate to the magnitude of the crime, the very attempt to achieve a certain measure of justice is also the way in which we recreate a more just universe. So thank you for what you did, and thank you for the model of what you did a generation ago. I'm here also in a formal capacity to tell you a little bit about something you are going to experience and something to which I want you to contribute not in monetary terms, or not only in monetary terms, but in substantive terms, which is about the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Let me begin by saying Mark Twain once said there are truth, lies, and statistics. So what I'm going to do is spend about 2 minutes giving you some statistics which will tell you a truth that will give you a sense of what's happened around the museum. We've now finished 2 years and 11 months as a museum. The museum has now had 6 million visitors. 70% of our visitors have been non-Jews, 30% have been Jews, which means that the museum has become a magnet for the American people and a shrine for the Jewish community, because 1 in 3 American Jews have visited the museum. 1.5% of the American Jewish community comes to the museum each month. There's two other statistics that are perhaps incredible. When we built the museum, we know that the average stay in a museum in Washington is 45 minutes. You could bet your life on it. The average stay in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is 3 hours and 15 minutes, which means people are giving us what is most precious of theirs, which is time. And they're giving us 4 and 5 times the amount of time that they're willing to give to any other museum. And the first response upon seeing the museum is, we must return. And then they utter a very important 4-letter word, which is with. And by that they mean we must return with our children, and I'm seeing many children with their parents here, with our grandchildren, with our spouses, with our friends. And younger people who want to come back with their parents who lived through the event. One other statistic which is also incredible. The museum, up until the recent government shutdown and this wonderfully warm and easy winter of Washington this year, the museum was at 100% of physical capacity 92% of the time. It's now down to about 88% of the time, but to give you an idea of what that means, let me give you images. It's the equivalent of telling a retailer that every day is the day after Thanksgiving. It's the equivalent of telling a priest that every Mass during the course of the week is the Mass of Christmas Eve, or a rabbi that every services 3 times a day are the equivalent of the attendance that you have at Kol Nidre evening, or the equivalent of telling the average homemaker that every dinner is Thanksgiving dinner, every meal is Thanksgiving dinner. That's part of the exhilaration of the experience of the museum. It's part of the exhaustion of the experience of the museum. Now we have to ask the question, why do people come? In part they come because we've created an extraordinary museum. In part they come for a very different reason, because the Holocaust has become, for better and for worse, and sometimes I really believe it's for worse, it's become the only absolute in a society in which everything is relative. People don't know what's good. They're not sure what's bad, but they know one thing very deeply, that this event was evil. And consequently, it's become the touchstone of moral conversation in the United States, and the touchstone of absolute evil. It's the one part of evil that we can say, this is abhorrent. And in fact, you see it because the only way people are able to say an event is terrible now is they call it the Holocaust. Even events that are not analogous, the only way you can describe it is it was a Holocaust, which is another way of saying it's absolute evil. You're going to see the museum on Sunday. You're going to learn that we are a storytelling museum, that you walk through the story of the Holocaust. And you're going to see that we tell the story of the Holocaust with artifacts and imagery, with films and with photographs in all sorts of ways. That you will experience, and you'll know quite well what we mean. Well, let me tell you another aspect of the museum that you're not going to experience, or not quite going to experience, which depends on you. 5th floor of the museum, we have a series, we are creating a research center that is going to be the central repository of a series of archives in the world today. We have archives, documentary archives and photo archives, film archives and music archives, oral history archives, and even statistics of victimization. And we present them to the public in an integrated way by computers and all sorts of ways. And we gather. We gather materials, we gather photographs, we gather artifacts, and this is where we turn to you. You have in your possessions material that is yours by right, but that really, when it comes time, should be shared with generations. For some of you, it's photographs, and for some of you, it's documents. If it's photographs, we're willing to copy them and leave the originals to you. If it's documents, we would prefer the originals, but if you insist, we will copy the documents and return the originals to you. And you're going to be working with us, with the Shoah Foundation, which is here, with one part of the experience of documenting the Holocaust that you alone must do, which is the way in which we retrieve information through oral history today and through video history in such a way that we can make it compelling and immediate. So those of you who, let's put it this way, there are some of you who are no longer here. Those of you who are blessed to be here and to celebrate the 50-year reunion may not take the memories that you have, that are historic, that are significant, that are important, and that must be documented for eternity. You may not keep those memories only unto yourself. We ask you to be available for testimony, because in reality the nature of this event is such that very often the devil is in the details. And very often an understanding of the whole is found in the smallest of details. And this is one of the first events in which we now have a technology that will be able to make it immediate for generations to come. The story. Some of you may know that I'm a baseball nut. I love baseball. I'm trying to finish a book off with two other people called Who Owns New York, Willie, Mickey, or the Duke, on a period when New York was New York and when the biggest debate and the debate that could set everybody off was who was better, Mickey Mantle, Duke Snyder, or Willie Mays. And on this, people would stake their lives in its debate. I see Ben Ferencz smiling. He probably has a position on that debate. Ken Burns, who did the great baseball movie, comes to my office one day and says, "Michael Berenbaum, I envy." So I said, "Ken Burns, what the hell do you envy me for? You've had all this tremendous achievements." He said, no, that's not the reason. He said, when I was trying to create with the Civil War, the closest I could come to the Civil War was to sit on the laps of old men and old women, who had sat on the laps of old men and old women, who had sat on the laps of old men and old women who had fought in the Civil War. And you have the possibility of having accessible to you living witnesses and of having this richness of material before you with which to create. The Civil War is 135 years ago. And people are still creating and still transmitting and still trying to understand the Civil War. The Holocaust is 50 years ago, and people are still creating, still struggling, still wrestling to understand the event. And you, ladies and gentlemen, have an opportunity once again to participate in history and to make your mark on eternity. So as you go home, as you consider what you have, consider what you can share. As you are requested, as you ask, as you are turned to, consider also that within you, your memories, your articulations, your understandings, and please share them with us. Final word, we of the younger generation salute you. We of the younger generation are indebted to you. And we of the younger generation so deeply appreciate what you did as very young men and very young women to rebuild in a very, very small measure the image of justice in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Berenbaum. some time now, I've been in touch with our next speaker. Can you hear me back there? Or?
Yeah, with the microphone, yeah.
I see. Michael Dina is a distinguished...
Daddy, pick up the mic. Pick up the mic.
Bill.
There you are.
William Dina is on the faculty of the College of St. Thomas, and I had the privilege of talking with him tonight about some of the things that he does in addition to being in charge of the music faculty out there. They have other things where he has participated as a lecturer, and I'm very interested in getting some of his notes on some of the things I've heard. He is a member of the International Roma Foundation. He's on the executive board. He's also the only Gypsy member of the United States Holocaust Council. And I think that that council was late in appointing him, but when they finally made their appointment, thank goodness it was Mr. Dina. It's a great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for the kind words. I hope you can hear me. I'm not very good when I hold a mic, but if you can hear me out there, fine. If you can't, just speak up, I'll be happy. By the way, I just want to say, Michael Berenbaum, all his sentiments, that really demonstrates what the United States Holocaust Museum is all about. He's a wonderful guy, wonderful speaker. I'm so glad he was here this evening to tell you what we're doing and what he would like to see you in return help us with. I want to thank everyone here for giving me the opportunity to speak here at this 50th anniversary of the International Military Tribunal. It's quite an honor for me. I speak across the country on the history of Gypsies in the Holocaust. I also teach, of course, at the University of St. Thomas on similarities and differences of Jews and Gypsies in the Holocaust. Very few people are aware of what a Gypsy is. In fact, I often, when I'm teaching in class, the very first thing I do is I ask my students, when you hear the word Gypsy, what comes to your mind? What do you imagine a Gypsy to be? And it's always interesting, some of their comments. They say, well, somebody traveling around in a wagon, or somebody dressed very outlandishly and in golden earrings, you know. And I listen to all these things. I say, yeah, you know, that's pretty much what Gypsies are. That's the Hollywood image of what a Gypsy is. It's the stereotype of what a Gypsy is. A real Gypsy is me. And I don't fit those things. I don't drive around in a wagon, and my family have never done that. There are some Gypsies who may, but on a whole they do not. In fact, many of them are sedentary. They live in one part of the country of Europe or one part or another in the United States or wherever. They don't move about. They don't travel about. So I just want to dismiss that stereotype that we're all wandering around the world. That's not us. In fact, many Gypsies have roots. They originally came from India, from the northern part of India. And we don't refer to ourselves as Gypsies. We refer to ourselves as Roma. And that's not cognate with roaming. It has nothing to do with roaming. The word Roma is from Sanskrit, and it means the people. Roma are the people. Our language is called Romanes. A man would be called a Rom, a woman would be called a Romi, and the Romane are the people. It's, again, not cognate with roaming or the country Romania. We came from the northern part of India into Europe around 1300 because of some great wars that occurred there, which forced us out of our homeland into Europe. And as we moved east into the Christian empire, so to speak, we found that Christianity looked at us and said, hey, these are Muslim people. They must be Muslim. They're from the east. And here they are moving west, and they're looking at us and they're saying, no, these are dark people. And it was almost like the dark angel versus the light angel. And Gypsies, to take off this pressure, or Roma, I should say, to take off this pressure and the suspicion of the church, said, hey, hold it. No, we're not Muslim, and we're not from the east. We're Christian Egyptians, and we're on a pilgrimage to Rome. They told them exactly what they wanted to hear. And the outcome of that was the church said, wow, Christian Egyptians. They opened the door, and in come the Roma. Well, from the corruption of the word Egyptian comes the word gypsy. So that's how we get that name. Yeah, pretty interesting. But I will tell you, today it's synonymous. Whether we call ourselves Roma or Gypsy, we're, I guess, one and the same people. Well, coming into Europe, there was a lot of suspicion that built up about gypsies. Number one, their skills. Fortune telling is a form of psychology. And folk medicine was something the church looked at and said, hey, this doesn't go too well with us because the peasants are becoming attracted to these people. They're telling their fortune, telling them these wonderful things. They have this folk medicine. They had a cure for the plague. And they didn't dare show it to many people because if they did, they could be burned at the stake as witches. So here you have these people who have this medicine. They tell you what you want to hear. And all of a sudden, they become in competition for the superstitious minds of the peasants with the church, you know. So the church said, hey, this is not too good. And the church was instrumental in keeping them on the move, and in fact, in some cases, enslaving them. In Romania, gypsies were enslaved for 500 years by the church and state. 500 years. And people who were not enslaved in gypsies were, for instance, musicians. My family have been musicians for literally centuries. You hear the gypsy violinists, the music of Hungary and Slovakia, the folk music of Eastern Europe is really gypsy music. If they tell you it's Hungarian music, they're not telling you the truth. It is gypsy music. And I'm very proud of that because we still carry on those traditions. Well, one of the reasons we have those traditions and they have carried on is because the music is so phenomenal and it's non-threatening, whereas fortune-telling and some of these other things became threatening to the church. So you have people who are constantly on the move because of the pressure placed on them because of the Christian church, Christianity, saying that these people are evil, they have these medicines that they give out, and it's black magic, and it's all these terrible things. This stereotype starts to develop in the minds of most Europeans. Now, we're looking around 1300, 1400. By the mid-1400s, you have trade guilds that are forming. Now, some of the skills of gypsies coming out of India, they were excellent metal workers. In fact, they still are today. In this country, I remember years ago where steel mills would look for these people because they had ways of repairing equipment in the steel mill that nobody else could do. And if they could repair these big furnaces, they didn't have to go out and replace them. And gypsies were the ones that could do that. So they had these skills, and highly skilled. Well, anyway, around 1400, 1500, in that era period, you had trade guilds that were forming, and they had laws passed saying that these gypsies can't practice their skills because they became in competition with the trade guilds. They had laws passed to either incarcerate them or keep them on the move. So now you have the church, you have the legal structure against these people, and they're really on the run. They can't make a living and they can't survive, and everybody hates them. And that is the seeds of hate that develop right up on into the Holocaust. You have people who are living on the fringes of society, trying to make a living, feed their children. They can't do it. Either the laws are against them, or the church is against them. The people are against them because they feel that they're evil. They're not evil. So you have a situation here that is ready for the boiling point. We had many laws throughout Europe that were passed against gypsies. As a matter of fact, in Spain, if you were a gypsy, you could be incarcerated. You didn't have to commit any crime. In fact, the Spanish manifest shows that Columbus, when he came to this country, brought over gypsies. He took these women, gypsy women, and they used them for these sailors and soldiers on these boats. Now that shows up in the Spanish manifest. We see also that the English colonies here in the United States were settled by many indentured slaves, gypsy indentured slaves from England. And perhaps some of the Minutemen that fought those wars that we hear so much about in our country were gypsies. There's a lot about our people that no one knows. We have been kept on the bottom, historically denied education, denied work in the workplace, housing, and that goes on. Well, now we have all these things boiling, and up comes the Holocaust. Would you be surprised to know that, I'm sure you will be surprised to know this, the first concentration camps by the Germans were built for gypsies as early as 1927 and 1929. That's before the Nazis came to power. We don't hear about that. We don't. In addition to that, there were concentration camps not only for gypsies, but they were in all the other concentration camps when the Nazis came into power. We don't hear about that. It's interesting. I've been hearing people speak this morning and this afternoon about the Nuremberg trials, and I don't understand why gypsies weren't brought to testify against what the Nazis were doing. I understand. It's just talking to around here again. There was a second trial. Am I correct? But the first one, no one brought them in. They had no representation. It was like, well, they're gypsies. Who cares? We lost, when the numbers come down to it, how many people have we lost? People often ask me that. They play this number game. We lost 80% of our people in the Second World War, in the Holocaust. There were at least, and I say at least, 1 million gypsies that died, and could be more than that, maybe 1.5 million to 2 million. We don't know, because we're just getting numbers now of what they did. We're just finding out these facts of what they did to our people. Just 2 years ago, Paul Polanski, an American from Stillville, Iowa, was doing research on Dvorak, and he happens to be of Czech descent. And he went to the Czech Republic and wanted to look at their archives. And they said, oh, American, the Iron Curtain has fallen down. Yeah, open up the archives to him. And in he goes. And what do you think he stumbles on? He stumbles on boxes and boxes and boxes of documents concerning gypsy concentration camps in the Czech Republic, which was run by the Czechs. That's amazing. We didn't know about this before. And he told me, I talked to Paul, he said there was about maybe 150 to 200 small feeder camps which fed into the main camp, which was called Legacy. And at Legacy, it was a killing station, or they would ship them on to Auschwitz. Now, I can't help but thinking in my mind, you know, the Nuremberg trials, if they would have asked a gypsy to come and testify, he might have said this is what was happening. And these people in the Czech Republic would have been brought and paid the price, like the Germans did. But they didn't. And these people are free today. And they murdered thousands and thousands. Guess how many thousands they were? Well, I'll tell you. Paul Polanski found 30,000 documents. He was able to smuggle out half of them, about 15,000. And we have copies of those documents in the United States Holocaust Museum. He estimates each document concerned a family. And the family can consist of extended families, so anywhere from 9 to 15 people per document. That can easily come to over 600,000 people. What happened, Nuremberg trials? Why didn't you people call us? Why didn't you find out about us? Here we are, almost 50 years later, and we're just finding these things out. What happened? I hear all these wonderful things, and believe me, you've done some wonderful things. But when it came to gypsies, somebody dropped the ball, or maybe threw it away. And I really feel hurt, because there were a lot of innocent people, women, children. Many of the medical experiments were done on gypsies. I was in Sachsenhausen a couple of years ago. And there's a building dedicated to the Roma and Sinti. By the way, Sinti are also the gypsy people. Coming out of India, there's a group of people called Sindhi, S-I-D-I. And the Sinti live in Germany, S-I-N-T-I. They're the same people, they speak the same language. They also were included in the final solution. In Sachsenhausen, they actually have a building. It was a pathology building where they took all gypsies and they dissected them after killing them to see what these experiments that they were doing. They made lampshades out of them, they cut their hair, they used their hair for insulation and all kinds of things that you would say, this is what heinous crimes. They did this on children, men, women, children. Why didn't we hear about this in the Nuremberg trial? Why didn't this come up? What happened? I asked that question. And it hurts. It honest to God hurts. Because I know you are all good people. I know you all wanted to do the right things. But somehow that ball got dropped. Or did it get thrown away because we were gypsies? I don't know. That's a question I'd like to ask. I would wish somebody would address it and say, well, we made a mistake because, for what reason? I just wanted to know. Somehow it doesn't. Anyway, here we are, 50 years later. What's happening for gypsies today? Well, the Holocaust has not ended for these people. They still are being persecuted in many of the countries. They're denied work in the workplace. The Czech Republic, since it has been broken off from Czechoslovakia, now you have Slovakia and the Czech Republic. Czechs treat them terrible, absolutely terrible. If a woman goes in for an operation on her arm, she may come out sterilized if she's a gypsy woman. They sterilize gypsy women. They want to get rid of it. That's a way of... And I don't see anybody getting up and raising arms about it. Helsinki Watch did some reports on it, some human rights organizations, ECOR. I have been to Europe on several different occasions to conferences concerning the cooperation of European countries and some of the human rights violations. Romania, when Ceausescu's government fell, everybody said, hey, wonderful democracy. And at that time, the people felt they could do anything, and they did. They went out, they attacked gypsies, they burned their homes, raped the women, killed the men, and we never even heard about it here, because if we did, that would make democracy look bad. But that's things that were happening, and it's a fact. I'm not making these up. I can show you all the news reports on this. Similar things are happening in the Slovakia and in the Czech Republic. We find all throughout Europe. If I was to ask you how many people you thought, how many gypsies there are in Europe, you would be surprised. You wouldn't know. I can tell you, there's between 9 and 10 million gypsies, and they're in every country in Europe, and it's one of the few languages that is spoken in every country, the Romanist language. And they are true pan-Europeans. If they lived in Austria for all their life, they consider themselves Austrians just like any other Austrian, but they're denied equal rights in the law. This is our situation today. We're trying desperately to get out information about what happened to people, our people in the Holocaust in the past, so that it will really make a change today. And that is happening. That is the benefit of the United States Holocaust Museum. By showing what happened, by giving the information, by documenting this, by people coming in and seeing what happened to gypsies, it causes an awareness where these governments now in Eastern Europe are willing to look at the human rights violations and look for possible solutions. They weren't doing that before because they figured, well, who cares about gypsies? We can get away with it and do it. And they were. But that is starting to change. And as we become stronger, when I say we, our gypsy people, become better educated and know our history, we're starting to make changes. We're causing changes. Let me tell you about my being on the United States Holocaust Council. Prior to my coming on the council, there wasn't going to be a gypsy on the council. And this is well documented. There's newspapers here, and there's articles saying, by various people saying that we're a bunch of cranks, that we weren't even a real people, and we had no place there. But because of our pressure and the help of many Jewish scholars who knew our true history, Simon Wiesenthal was one of them, who knew what happened to gypsies. They weren't allowed to let that happen, and we were able to open that door. And I was appointed by the President of the United States. Ronald Reagan appointed me, and then later Bush reappointed me before he left office. And since that time, I can honestly tell you, there has been enormous change for gypsies in Europe. As the museum was built, more information about what happened to our people everyone became aware of it. They couldn't hide from what they were doing in Germany, and they can't hide from what they're doing now to our people. And we keep pointing the finger at it, we make everyone aware of it, and it's causing change. Somebody asked me, well, what do you, Bill Dina, what do you expect to get out of this? Well, number one, I don't expect to get anything financially. My pot of gold will be when a gypsy child can lift up his head and say, I'm a gypsy, and look at the other child and say, and what are you? And feel good about himself, and not be ashamed or worried that he's going to get beaten up, or his parents' home might get burned, or something very tragic, but they can feel good about who they are. Then I found my pot of gold. Because in this country, I don't have to worry about that. My children don't have to worry about it. Your children don't have to worry about it. But in Europe, they do. Once again, I'd like to thank you for giving me this opportunity, and I just wanted to make you aware. I don't want to make anyone feel bad. I told Drexel, I said, gee, I just want to know, why wasn't a gypsy called to testify? Could any of you tell me that? Please come up and tell me. I'd like to know what was going on.
I can tell you that.
Sure.
Does this mic work?
No, come on here.
Yeah, I think I'll come up there. I know it's late, and I know you all want to go to bed or do other things, but I think it's called for an answer to a question, and I think it's important to
to answer it. The Holocaust against the Sinti and Roma people was dealt with extensively in the Einsatzgruppen trial, case number 9 at Nuremberg. The truth is that the Gypsies were treated the same as the Jews. I'm using the term Gypsies because you use it. Sure. It's a pejorative term normally. And we use the Zigeuner, the German word for it. They were treated the same as the Jews. They were marked for total annihilation. The Einsatzgruppen, who were responsible for that, were tried at Nuremberg. It was a special trial on that subject. Judge Musmano, in his judgment, went at great length interrogating the criminals, saying, why do you persecute and murder these people who are only noted for their music and their gaiety and their laughter and so on. So it was dealt with. The question why we didn't call any witnesses is a very clear one. I was the chief prosecutor in that case, and I didn't call a single witness of any kind, although the DP camps were full of thousands of people who had been prepared to testify against every one of those defendants that they personally saw that defendant murder his parents or his children. I didn't call the witnesses because I had the documents, and the documents were reliable, and the witnesses would not be reliable. Their own hatred and their fear and their terror at the time made them unreliable in my judgment as a witness, and so I never called them, and it wasn't necessary to call them, because the German documentation was comprehensive. It showed that they were determined to exterminate the Gypsies for reasons of their own. We went into some of those reasons later when I tried to get compensation for the survivors, and there was a whole action in Germany related to that. Not very successful, I'm afraid to say. But nevertheless, a serious effort was made. So the criticism does not lie with Nuremberg. The criticism lies with the inherent, just as there's anti-Semitism, there is an anti-Gypsy feeling which has to be cured. And the attempt at Nuremberg to create a new ethos, a new feeling of humanity toward all human beings, certainly encompasses the Sinti and Roma as well. And we've done the best we could under the circumstances, but people haven't all changed.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Nice to have the man right at the top tell you. I've always been one to go right to the top. I don't like to fool around. But to be honest with you, I appreciate very much what you have said. But it still leaves this question over, why didn't we know about the Czech Republic? What kind of an investigation did we have on behalf of Gypsies? Why was that not known? Why did that information not come out? Was it because it was just overlooked because, for whatever reasons? And those are reasons and questions that still kind of ring to my mind. But I thank you very much for telling me the facts, and I appreciate that very much. Once again, I'd like to thank you for giving me this opportunity, Drexel. I appreciate very much the fact that I'm here, and I can address you people, and you learned something about me, and I've learned something about you, and I'm walking away with some real positive things. So thank you very much.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
Bill Duna, it's been good for us to hear from you. And I'd only like to add one thing to what Benny said. I don't know his details in the Einsatzgruppen case. Partly it's the fact that the Germans, in speaking of the Holocaust, always spoke in terms of, number one, Jews, and then number two come the Zigeuner, the Gypsies, and then came the Bolsheviks and the commissars and so on, who were going to be exterminated. But the documents, and as they were read at Nuremberg,
Talk into the mic, Rick.
the documents that we did read at Nuremberg, and I have sent you a chapter from a proposed book I have, which is devoted entirely to the Gypsies, did have some references to the Gypsies in them. But I, in the memo I sent you, in the little chapter I sent you, admitted that I believed that at Nuremberg we should have had a separate presentation on the persecution and the eradication of the Gypsies, instead of wrapping it in with the whole subject. And I do say that we made a mistake in that respect, as far as I'm concerned. And I'm glad you've spoken out.
Thank you.
We have one more thing that we want to do this evening.
To the mic. Swap on the microphone.
Thank you, Ben.
Hi, you're supposed to
Karen Germaine would like to talk a couple of minutes about some very important work that's being done about the Shoah Foundation in terms of some interviews in which you've all been concerned. So please come up and tell us briefly.
Briefly. I'll be very brief because I know it's late and you probably all want to get out of here, reminisce a little bit more. I want to talk to you a little bit about survivors of the Shoah Foundation. Survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation is a nonprofit organization that was founded 2 years ago by Steven Spielberg. Mr. Spielberg founded this foundation out of a deeply moving and enlightening experience that he had making the movie Schindler's List. Mr. Spielberg decided it was important for historical preservation and education of future generations to videotape the life stories of Holocaust survivors and many of those who were also touched in some way by the Holocaust, and to do this work before it's too late. In the past year and a half, the Shoah Foundation has taped over 13,000 testimonies in 18 languages, including sign language, in 26 countries worldwide, and will tape tens of thousands of more testimonies over the next 2 years. These testimonies will eventually be made available to learning institutions around the world via online technologies, which are just now being developed. Mr. Spielberg and the Shoah Foundation recognize the invaluable contributions made by the Nurembergers and by individuals involved with other Holocaust war crimes trials as well. And we want your stories represented in our archive. As many of you have brought to my attention, there already exists a great amount of historical record of these trials and numerous biographies of those who were involved. So what makes the Shoah Foundation project a little different? And why should you participate? The strength of this archive lies not in the vast numbers of testimonies that it includes, and not just in the cutting-edge technologies that we're creating. Its power lies in the individual images that we present. The faces, your faces, the voices, all of your voices, sharing your life experiences with future generations. I'd like each of you to remember back to your childhood. I'm sure you grew up in cities and towns and countries all over the world and had very different kinds of childhoods, each and every one of you. And who amongst you could have ever imagined that when you grew up that you'd be involved in the Nuremberg trials? Who could have imagined that and the contributions that each of you would make? Despite the modesty of some of you to whom I've spoken, in minimizing the roles that some of you played, it's a very modest group, it's unbelievable, truly, in minimizing the roles that you played, the truth is the success of these trials were because of you, and you played a very important role in all our collective history. So, the question that's so often asked, what's the legacy of Nuremberg? You are. You're the legacy of Nuremberg. Your stories are the legacy of Nuremberg. And I hope you will bequeath to your children, your grandchildren, and children around the world your personal stories so that each of us will know what you have achieved, and each of us will be inspired to also achieve great things. One of your colleagues, Mr. Charles Horsky, couldn't be with us at the reunion because of ill health, but my colleague, Judge Bruce Einhorn, who's in the back of the room today, brought to Mr. Horsky, brought to his home today good wishes from all of you at the reunion, as well as good wishes from the Shoah Foundation. Today is Charles Horsky's birthday, and the gift he gave to us today was his story. I would encourage each of you here today to also please give us this gift. And I also ask that you encourage others who aren't here with us today, who were involved in either the Nuremberg trials or other war crimes trials, to please be in touch with us and tell their stories. I'll be here for the next few days to answer your questions about the project. I've got materials you can take with you, and I look forward to meeting each and every one of you. And again, I hope you'll share your stories with us as your lasting legacy.